Chapter 1. You've seen it before, and you didn't like what it said about reality. You watched a guy who doesn't seem polished, doesn't overthink what he says, doesn't move carefully, and somehow the energy around him feels lighter, easier, more alive than the way you've been approaching things. You noticed how he speaks without measuring every word, how he doesn't seem worried about whether he's saying the perfect thing. And somehow that lack of hesitation creates a presence that pulls attention toward him without effort. You didn't want to admit it at first because it challenges everything you've been doing, but the pattern kept repeating in different places until it became impossible to ignore. You started realizing that attraction responds to something deeper than being nice, respectful, and consistent in the way most people describe. And if you're being honest with yourself for a second, you've probably felt the frustration that comes from doing everything the right way and still feeling like you're being overlooked. You show up with good intentions, you listen, you try to make conversations comfortable, and you carry yourself in a way that you believe should naturally lead to connection. But then you watch someone else walk in with less effort, less calculation, and somehow create a stronger emotional reaction without trying nearly as hard. That disconnect starts messing with your understanding of how attraction actually works, because it doesn't line up with what you've been told should matter most. You don't need anyone to explain to you that there's a difference between respect and attraction, because you've already experienced it. You've had moments where someone appreciated you, valued your presence, maybe even trusted you, but the energy never crossed into something deeper. You could feel it in the way conversations stayed safe, in the way the interaction never carried tension, in the way nothing ever felt uncertain enough to create excitement. That's the part most guys avoid looking at closely, because it forces you to question whether being liked is the same as being desired. The truth starts showing itself when you pay attention to how people respond emotionally instead of logically. Attraction isn't something that grows from everything being smooth and predictable. It comes from feeling something that isn't fully controlled, something that creates a little bit of unpredictability in the interaction. That doesn't mean chaos or disrespect or acting out of character. It means there's a certain energy that exists when someone isn't trying to manage every outcome, and that energy is what people respond to. You might have caught glimpses of this in your own life without realizing what you were looking at. Think about times when you weren't focused on trying to impress anyone, when you were just present, saying what came naturally, moving through conversations without calculating every response. The way people reacted to you during those moments probably felt different, even if you didn't fully understand why at the time. There's something about being unfiltered in a grounded way that changes how others experience your presence. What gets misunderstood is the idea that this energy belongs to a certain type of person. People label it as something only bad boys have, as if it's tied to a personality that can't be replicated or understood. But when you look closer, it has less to do with who someone is on the surface and more to do with how they relate to outcomes. The difference shows up in how much someone needs a certain reaction to feel secure in the interaction. When someone needs the conversation to go a certain way, you can feel it. It shows up in hesitation, in over-explaining, in trying to smooth over every moment that feels slightly uncomfortable. That need creates pressure, even when the words themselves sound kind and thoughtful. On the other hand, when someone is comfortable with whatever direction the interaction takes, there's a freedom in how they speak and move that feels completely different. You've probably felt that difference when talking to people who don't seem attached to the outcome of the conversation. They're engaged, present, and interested, but they're not trying to control how you respond. That creates a space where the interaction can breathe, where things can unfold naturally instead of being guided toward a specific result. That space is where attraction starts building because it allows emotion to exist without being managed. And this is where things begin shifting for you. Because once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. The energy you thought was exclusive to certain types of men is actually something that comes from a specific mindset about how you approach interactions. It's not about copying behavior or pretending to be someone you're not. It's about removing the pressure you've been placing on every moment and allowing yourself to exist inside the interaction without constantly trying to shape it. You don't need to become someone else to access that energy. You need to stop holding on to the idea that every interaction needs to lead somewhere. That's where the tension comes from. That's where the hesitation begins. And that's what quietly removes the natural flow that creates attraction in the first place. If this is starting to click for you in a way that feels a little uncomfortable, that's a good sign. That discomfort usually means you're seeing something you've experienced but never fully acknowledged. Go ahead and drop a comment if you've ever felt like you were doing everything right but still not getting the response you expected. Because a lot of people recognize that feeling once they hear it out loud. And if this perspective is hitting you in a way that's different from what you've heard before, tap the like button so more people who've been stuck in that same loop can come across this and start seeing it differently too. Chapter 2. He told me the whole thing like it didn't make sense, like he had been following a set of rules that were supposed to lead somewhere predictable, and instead, everything just kept looping back to the same result. He said he met her through mutual friends. Nothing unusual, just a normal setting where people are talking, laughing, moving around, and getting comfortable around each other. From the beginning, he approached it the way he always had, calm, respectful, paying attention, making sure the conversation stayed smooth and easy to follow. He listened closely, responded thoughtfully, and made sure she felt comfortable, because in his mind, that's what creates connection. For a while, everything seemed fine on the surface, and that's what confused him the most later on. Time went on, he noticed something subtle that he couldn't quite explain at first, and it started showing up in the way she interacted with him compared to someone else in the same environment. There was another guy around, someone who didn't seem nearly as careful, someone who interrupted sometimes, joked in ways that weren't always polished, and didn't seem concerned about whether everything he said landed perfectly. He wasn't disrespectful, but he definitely wasn't managing every moment the way my friend was, and yet the energy around him felt different. You could see it in how she reacted, how her attention shifted, how the conversation with him carried more tension, more unpredictability, and more emotional movement. That difference started bothering him because it didn't line up with what he believed about how attraction should work, and he found himself trying to close that gap without really understanding what was creating it. He began putting more effort into the interaction, thinking that maybe he just needed to show more interest or be more consistent in how he showed up. His messages became more thoughtful, his conversations more intentional, and he made sure there were no awkward silences or unclear moments. From his perspective, he was doing everything right, making sure the connection had no friction, no confusion, nothing that could be misinterpreted. What he didn't see at the time was that the very thing he believed was helping him was actually removing something essential from the interaction. The more he tried to keep everything smooth, the more predictable the connection became, and predictability started flattening the emotional energy between them. There was no room for tension, no space for curiosity, no moment where she had to lean in and figure him out because everything was already laid out clearly. Meanwhile, the other guy wasn't creating that kind of structure at all, and because of that, the interaction with him had a completely different rhythm. At one point, he told me about a moment that stuck with him because it made everything click later on, even though he didn't understand it in real time. They were all sitting together, and she made a small comment that was slightly teasing, the kind of comment that invites a reaction without being serious. My friend responded in a careful way, making sure the tone stayed friendly and nothing felt off, but the other guy responded without thinking too much about it, throwing the energy right back at her in a way that was a little unpredictable. She laughed harder at that response, and the moment carried forward in a way that felt alive, while my friend's response faded almost immediately. That moment stayed with him because it showed something he couldn't ignore anymore, even if he didn't have the language for it yet. It wasn't about being nicer, smarter, or more thoughtful, because he was already doing all of that. It was about how he was relating to the interaction itself, how much he was trying to guide it, shape it, and make sure it stayed within a certain range of comfort. The other guy wasn't doing that, and because of that, the interaction had more movement, more uncertainty, and more energy that couldn't be predicted ahead of time. After a while, he stopped focusing on what the other guy was doing and started looking at his own behavior from a different angle, and that's when things started becoming clearer. He realized that every time he spoke, there was a small calculation happening in the background, a quiet check to make sure what he was about to say would land well. That calculation wasn't obvious to anyone else, but it shaped the way he carried himself, and it removed the natural flow that comes from speaking without needing to control the outcome. Once he saw that, something shifted in how he approached conversations, not just with her, but with everyone, and the difference was immediate in a way that surprised him. He stopped trying to make every moment smooth, stopped trying to guide the interaction toward a specific result, and started allowing conversations to unfold without needing them to stay perfectly comfortable. That didn't turn him into someone else. It just removed the pressure he had been placing on himself to manage everything. And that pressure had been the very thing flattening the energy of his interactions. When he told me all of this, it didn't sound like some breakthrough moment where everything suddenly became easy. It sounded like someone realizing they had been holding on to something without knowing it. He didn't become louder or more aggressive or start acting out of character. He just stopped trying to control how every moment was received. And once that happened, the way people responded to him changed in a way that felt natural instead of forced, because the interaction finally had space to breathe. You've probably had moments like that yourself, even if you didn't recognize them at the time, where you weren't trying to impress anyone, and the interaction felt more alive because of it. That's the part most people overlook, because it doesn't look like a technique or a strategy. It just looks like someone being present without needing to manage the outcome. And once you start noticing that pattern, it becomes impossible to go back to the way you were approaching things before without seeing what was missing. Chapter 3. You're still doing it in ways you don't even notice yet, and that's the part that keeps this cycle going longer than it needs to. It shows up in the way you pause for half a second before you say something that could go either way, in the way you adjust your tone slightly to make sure it lands well, in the way you smooth over moments that could have created a little tension. None of it feels obvious while you're doing it, because it feels responsible, it feels thoughtful. It feels like you're just being aware of how your words affect someone else. But underneath that awareness is a quiet need for the interaction to stay within a certain emotional range, and that need shapes everything more than the words themselves ever could. When someone senses that kind of control, even subconsciously, the interaction starts losing its edge. It becomes easy to predict, easy to follow, easy to stay inside without ever feeling pulled deeper into it. That doesn't mean it becomes bad. It just becomes safe in a way that doesn't create movement. And you've probably felt that from the other side before, talking to someone who is kind, respectful, and easy to be around. But the conversation never quite takes you anywhere. It stays on the surface, moving smoothly, but never creating the kind of energy that makes you think about it later. The difference you've been noticing in other men doesn't come from them having better lines or better timing or some hidden script they're following. It comes from the fact that they aren't holding on to the outcome the way you are. When they speak, there's no extra layer of calculation running in the background, no quiet adjustment happening before every sentence. What comes out is what they actually think in that moment, shaped by their personality but not filtered through the need to be received a certain way. That creates a level of honesty in the interaction that feels different, even if the content of what they're saying isn't anything special. You might resist that idea at first because it sounds like letting go of control means letting things become messy or unpredictable in a way that could backfire. And in some cases, it will. Because not every moment is meant to land perfectly. Not every interaction is meant to feel smooth. But that's where the energy comes from allowing moments to exist without immediately trying to correct them. When something feels slightly off or unexpected, it creates space for a real reaction instead of a managed one. And that's where the interaction starts feeling alive again. Think about how different it feels when you're talking to someone who doesn't seem concerned about how they're coming across. There's a looseness in the way they move through the conversation, a willingness to let things land however they land. You don't feel like they're trying to guide you toward a specific response, and because of that, your own reactions become more natural. You laugh more easily, you respond more freely, and the interaction takes on a rhythm that doesn't feel controlled. That rhythm is what most people are actually responding to when they say someone has presence. What you've been doing, without realizing it, is creating a version of yourself that fits inside the interaction instead of letting the interaction adjust to you. You've been shaping your responses based on what you think will keep things comfortable, and over time, that creates a version of you that feels consistent but not dynamic. It's reliable, but it doesn't create those moments where someone leans in a little closer, where the conversation takes a turn that neither of you expected, where something real shows up without being planned. When you stop doing that, when you allow yourself to speak without that extra layer of control, something changes immediately in how the interaction feels. It's not about saying something wild or out of character. It's about letting your actual thoughts come through without reshaping them on the way out. That might feel unfamiliar at first because you're used to adjusting everything slightly before you say it. But that adjustment is exactly what's been flattening your presence. You'll start noticing it in small ways, in how conversations begin to carry more energy, and in how people respond with more engagement instead of just polite acknowledgement. The interaction starts feeling less like something you're managing and more like something you're part of. And that shift changes everything without you needing to force it. You're no longer trying to create attraction. You're allowing the conditions for it to exist naturally by removing the pressure you were placing on every moment. And the part that really changes things is how you feel while all of this is happening. When you're not constantly checking yourself, not constantly adjusting, not constantly thinking about how things are being received, there's a level of ease that comes back into the way you carry yourself. That ease is noticeable, even if no one can explain why, because it shows up in your tone, your timing, your presence, and the way you move through the interaction without hesitation. Once you feel that difference, it becomes hard to go back to the old way of doing things without noticing how much effort it required. You realize how much of your attention was being used to manage something that didn't need to be controlled in the first place. And from that point on, the way you approach conversations starts shifting naturally, because you've experienced what it feels like to let the interaction breathe instead of holding it tightly in place. Chapter 4. You're going to feel the urge to grab onto this and turn it into something you can control again, and that's the part that quietly resets everything back to where it was. The moment you realize that letting go of outcome changes how people respond to you, your mind immediately tries to package it into something repeatable, something you can apply step by step so you don't lose that effect. That instinct feels useful because it gives you a sense of direction, but it also brings back the same pressure you were just starting to remove. You begin thinking about when to be relaxed, how relaxed to be, how to make sure you're not trying too hard while still trying enough, and without realizing it, you're back inside your own head again. The interaction starts feeling managed again, just in a slightly different way, and the energy shifts back toward predictability. This is where most guys stall out, because they understand the idea, but they don't fully change the way they relate to the moment. They still want the interaction to go somewhere. They still want a certain response, and that desire shapes how they show up, even when they're trying to appear more natural. You can see it in the way someone says something and then immediately watches for a reaction, in the way they slightly adjust themselves mid-conversation depending on how things are going. That constant monitoring pulls you out of the interaction and places you just outside of it, observing instead of participating, and people can feel that distance even if they can't explain it. When someone is fully present, there's no split between what they're saying and what they're thinking about how it's being received. Their attention stays inside the moment instead of bouncing back and forth between the interaction and their own internal commentary. That creates a different kind of connection because it allows things to unfold without interruption. You're not stepping in to correct the tone. You're not smoothing over every edge. You're letting the conversation move in its own direction and responding as it does. That responsiveness creates a rhythm that feels real, and that rhythm is what pulls people in without needing to force anything. You might notice that this changes how you handle moments that don't go perfectly, because you're no longer trying to keep everything within a narrow range of comfort. If something comes out a little off, you don't rush to fix it. You let it exist for a second and see what happens. Sometimes it turns into something better than what you would have said if you had overthought it. Sometimes it just passes and the conversation keeps moving. Either way, you stay inside the flow instead of stepping out to manage it, and that consistency builds a kind of presence that feels grounded instead of controlled. There's also a shift in how you interpret other people's reactions, because you're not tying your sense of direction to every small response anymore. If someone laughs, you don't take it as confirmation that you're doing things right, and if they don't, you don't take it as a signal that something needs to be corrected immediately. You start seeing reactions as part of the interaction instead of feedback that needs to be acted on in real time. That frees you from constantly adjusting yourself, and it allows the interaction to develop its own momentum instead of being guided at every step. As this becomes more natural, you'll notice that the conversations you have start carrying a different kind of weight, even when the topics themselves are simple. There's a sense that something real is happening instead of something being performed, and people respond to that without needing to understand why. They lean in a little more, they engage a little deeper, and the interaction starts feeling less like an exchange and more like an experience. That shift doesn't come from saying anything special. It comes from how you're showing up in the moment. You'll also start recognizing when you slip back into the old pattern, because it feels tighter, more controlled, more effortful than it needs to be. You catch yourself thinking about how something is landing instead of just letting it land, and that awareness gives you the chance to step back into the moment again. It's not about being perfect with this. It's about noticing when you've stepped out of the interaction and gently bringing yourself back into it without overcorrecting. That kind of awareness builds over time, and it makes the whole process feel less like something you're trying to get right and more like something you're experiencing fully. The reason this connects to what you've been calling that bad boy energy is because it's often misunderstood as confidence or boldness on the surface, when it's really coming from this deeper place of not needing the interaction to go a certain way. When someone isn't attached to the outcome, they naturally move through conversations with less hesitation, less adjustment, and more presence. That presence is what creates the tension, the curiosity, and the emotional movement that you've been noticing. It's not about acting a certain way. It's about removing the need to control how things unfold. And once you start living inside that instead of thinking about it from the outside, everything begins shifting without you needing to force it. Conversations feel lighter, interactions feel more engaging, and you stop feeling like you're trying to create something that should already be there. You're simply allowing it to exist by not interfering with it, and that changes how people experience you in a way that no technique ever could. Chapter 5. At some point, you're going to realize that the thing you've been chasing this whole time was never something you had to add to yourself. It was something you had to stop interfering with. That realization doesn't hit like a sudden breakthrough. It settles in slowly as you start moving through interactions differently without forcing it. You notice that conversations feel less like something you're trying to get right and more like something you're simply inside of. The pressure you used to carry into every moment begins disappearing, and in its place, there's a kind of steadiness that doesn't need to prove itself. That steadiness is what you were seeing in other people the whole time, and now it starts showing up in you without you having to think about it. What changes most is how you relate to uncertainty, because that's where everything you've been learning either holds or collapses. When you no longer feel the need to control how things unfold, uncertainty stops feeling like something you need to fix and starts feeling like part of the experience itself. You don't rush to fill every silence. You don't scramble to correct every moment that feels slightly off. And you don't tie your sense of direction to how someone responds in real time. That creates space. And inside that space, people start responding to you differently because they're no longer being guided toward a specific reaction. The interaction becomes something shared instead of something managed, and that difference is felt immediately even if no one can explain it out loud. You'll start seeing this show up in ways that feel almost surprising at first, because the reactions you get begin shifting without you doing anything extra. People engage more, conversations carry further, and there's a sense of ease that wasn't there before. It's not because you've learned a new way to speak, it's because you've removed the constant adjustment that was shaping everything you said. That removal lets your personality come through in a way that feels consistent and grounded. And that's what people respond to when they talk about presence without knowing how to describe it. You're no longer trying to create a moment. You're allowing the moment to form around you. The part that really changes things is how this carries over into every interaction, not just the ones where you're thinking about attraction. When you stop trying to manage how you're perceived, you start showing up the same way everywhere. And that consistency builds a kind of confidence that doesn't rely on outcomes. You're not switching between versions of yourself depending on the situation. You're moving through everything with the same level of presence. That removes a lot of the tension you didn't even realize you were carrying, and it makes everything feel more natural, because you're not constantly adjusting yourself to fit the moment. Over time, that becomes your baseline instead of something you have to think about. And when you look back at how you used to approach things, you'll probably notice how much energy was going into trying to keep everything within a certain range. You were managing tone, managing reactions, managing the direction of conversations, all while trying to stay relaxed on the surface. That kind of effort adds up, even if it feels subtle while you're doing it, and it creates a version of you that feels controlled instead of present. Letting that go doesn't make you careless. It makes you real in a way that people can feel immediately. That's the shift that changes how everything unfolds from that point forward. If this clicked for you in a way that felt different from what you're used to hearing, take a second and leave a comment about what part stood out the most, because that moment of recognition is where everything starts shifting. Someone else reading it might see themselves in the same pattern and realize what's been missing without being able to put it into words before. And if this changed how you're thinking about attraction even a little bit, hit the like button so more people who've been stuck in that same loop can come across this and start seeing it differently. If you want more of these conversations that break things down in a way that actually connects, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because once you start understanding this, you'll start seeing it everywhere.